most of the time when people claim they've got some kind of idea that contradicts mainstream science, it turns out to be wrong. But we must always bear in mind the possibility that sometimes it's right. Very occasionally it's right. And so you have to be open to that possibility.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with Anomalistic Psychologist Chris French, that's his self-description, about his engaging and controversial new book, The Science of Weird Shit: Why Our Minds Conjure the Paranormal. Chris argues that a full understanding of the human condition must include consideration of the psychological roots of paranormal belief and experiences. Welcome, Chris. It's great to meet. I used to be really interested in all of this. You resurrect some memories. Why is an understanding of the human condition require this consideration of the psychological roots of the paranormal?
And the reason this is important is because there isn't a society anywhere on the planet, either geographically or historically, where people have not held these kinds of beliefs, and a sizable minority of the population claim to have directly had these experiences. Now, it's possible, of course, that that's an indication that some paranormal phenomena are genuinely paranormal in the sense of they are beyond explanation in terms of conventional scientific concepts. But another possibility, and one that really interests me, is that maybe we've all got very similar brains, and we have had for many, many millennia. And maybe what we've got here is a situation where sometimes the neural wiring that we've got leads us to misinterpret, misremember, misperceive, and so on. And maybe psychology can offer better explanations than the paranormal ones.
So as I hear it, there are really two perspectives that we have in investigating the paranormal. One is to determine the veracity or the real underlying reality of the phenomena, which is traditionally the way people look at it. And the other is to look at it in terms of the psychology of belief systems, why we believe what we believe across a broad front. So there's two different perspectives, and we'll try to keep each one teased apart to some degree so that we can appreciate it. But certainly both are important. And I would absolutely agree with that. So I enjoyed the book in general, but in chapter 1, you have this very long list. I think it goes over 3 pages or so of all the examples, and it's just it's sort of like a tsunami of waves of all of these paranormal ideas. Just throw out a dozen or so. I mean, you must have 100 there or more.
Oh, yeah. Even that list was only a partial list, Robert. There was a lot more that I could have added in.
Yeah.
I mean, the point of that exercise was to make readers realize that although the paranormal is one of those ideas that we all think we understand what it means, it's actually quite tricky to define in a way that everybody would agree upon. So I kind of put out a load of different phenomena there and ask the readers to just make the decision: do you think this is this is paranormal, or would you not put it in the paranormal basket? So it included things that I think everybody would include. That would be extrasensory perception, which itself includes telepathy, precognition, and clairvoyance, also psychokinesis, and also evidence relating to the possibility of life after death. It would all agree that that's all paranormal. But then we get on to stuff which parapsychologists might not describe as paranormal, but the mass media and myself as an anomalistic psychologist would probably put in that basket. That would include things like UFOs, alien abduction claims, the Bermuda Triangle, astrology, firewalking. The list goes on and on and on. And really, I suppose the way I often summarize that is just to say anything weird and wonderful, the kind of thing that the mass media love to kind of make programs about or have articles about.
So now you use the term everything wild and wonderful, which is a nice, but the book's title is called Weird Shit. And,
Yeah.
so how do you go from this very genteel, wild and wonderful to weird shit?
Well, this started off as a joke. I mean, initially I was going to call the book "Why Weird Stuff Matters," and I still think that's quite a good title because it really gets at what I'm trying to get at in the book.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But occasionally to a friend, I'd say, or I might just call it the science of weird shit. And almost without exception, people said, "Oh, I'd buy that." So it was purely a marketing ploy.
Right. Okay. Well,
One thing that kind of worried me slightly, we did decide to go with that title in the end, but I don't want people to think that I'm kind of treating this flippantly because I'm not. I do take these things seriously. And of course, that title might imply that I don't, that I think it's all nonsense and doesn't deserve thinking about. And it's quite the opposite. I think these things are really interesting, fascinating, and can tell us something important about human psychology.
good. Well, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the title kind of fighting against the content. It kind of can be an engaging thing. I mean, I found it that way, and I think that's good. Now, when I looked at the list, it, as you said, included the expected parapsychology stuff like telepathy, but also what I classified as pseudosciences like astrology, as you said, conspiracy theories like fake moon landings, religious claims, angels and demons and miracles, um, crypto creatures, even like the Loch
Mhm.
Ness monster, and even you bring in hypnosis and alternative and complementary medicine, which um, has shown to have some in some cases therapeutic benefits, like aspects of agriculture. So why do you kind of lump all these together like a collection of random variables, random vegetables in a beef stew? I mean, they're all sort of mixed together.
No, but like, yeah, I wasn't putting forward that list as saying that I believe that all of the following are paranormal. I was getting the reader to think about what they would
Ah,
classify
mm,
as being
mm,
paranormal,
mm.
and the point there was to try to get them to realize that coming up with a definition of paranormal is not that easy. It's an exercise I used to do with my students to ask them if they could come up with a definition that they all agreed about, which would only include things which they genuinely thought were paranormal and would exclude everything else. I get them to do small group discussions, and it brought home to them the fact it's one of those slippery concepts. There's a lot of those in psychology where we all know what that means until you actually have to define it, and then you realize it's not such a straightforward concept.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that completely. And in a few minutes, I want to get to some precise definitions that we can talk about. But I had that experience as well. I last year did a major paper on theories of consciousness called The Landscape of Consciousness. And one out of 200 different theories dealt with what I call the paranormal. And when it was a pre-publication release, I got a lot of very critical comments, including from friends who are parapsychologists who really despise the word paranormal and wanted me to use psi for the scientific. So they in their mind had a very clear distinction that paranormal is to be eschewed from their perspective, but psi reflected the scientific view.
Again, it's an interesting. I mean, this happens a lot, doesn't it? I mean, and again, in psychology in particular, where certain terms, certain phrases become unpopular for various reasons. I mean, we've just seen it in ufology. I still think I still refer to UFOs.
Yeah, me too.
Like,
UAPs don't do it for me.
I don't do it for me either. UFOs is a perfectly descriptive term. It works, but and that happens. I mean, and in a while, probably people will start having objections to the term psi being used, and
Yeah,
they'll come up with
right,
something else. But
right.
as long as I think the important thing is you make it clear what you mean when you are using the phrase, and as long as the reader knows that, then they know where they are.
Yeah, my initial sense in going through the book is that you're framing each of these topics more from the perspective of belief system psychology. Why do we believe what we believe? Why do we want to believe the things that we do? Which is a very valuable probe of human mentality, as you've stated, and we'll cover that in detail, but not as concerned with the veracity of the claims, at least at this point. And one gets the feeling that you seem to suggest, it's not like covert; it's pretty overt. That it's to spend time on the veracity of these things is not very useful, because pretty much all of them are illusion, delusion, fraud, myths, or fables. But in doing that, aren't you, and when I see this list, aren't you painting them all with the same amount of tarnish, dismissing them all with the same level of utter rejection? Now, I, for one, would not assign the same level of utter rejection to, say, telepathy as I would to flat earth theories.
I think that's a very good point, and I do kind of try to go on my way to say, I mean, one very fundamental point for me as a somebody who self-identifies as a skeptic is that it's a really important aspect of skepticism to be open to the possibility that you might be wrong, and I also acknowledge that there are certain areas within parapsychology that can't be readily dismissed, that are not, we don't have conclusive skeptical counter arguments. I mean, I'd include things like the Ganzfeld studies,
Right.
spontaneous past life memories, and a few other areas. Now, basically, what that means for me is that I think that I'm not convinced by the evidence as it currently stands, but it's not easy to dismiss either. And I'm open to seeing what new data comes in on those fronts, and whether we ever get to a point where some of these things can be established beyond reasonable doubt to the satisfaction of the wider scientific community, we will see. But I certainly don't think that all of these different things should be kind of dismissed. I think the example you gave there, I mean, I think that's a very good example that flat earth theory would be way, way down the list in terms of possibly being true. But some of these other things, I would say, yeah, they are a real challenge to skeptics. That doesn't mean to say that at the end of the day, I'm going to come down saying, okay, I'm convinced by the evidence. But it's important to treat those kind of areas with respect. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this. There's a lot of skeptics who will come out with statements like, there is no evidence for the existence of telepathy. Well, that's just nonsense. Of course, there's lots of evidence. There's the evidence from people's everyday experience, but maybe more convincingly for the likes of you and I, there's evidence from things like Ganzfeld studies and so on. I mean, the Ganzfeld studies typically are kind of actually studies of telepathy, where you have a sender and a receiver, and the receiver is in a state of mild perceptual deprivation. The idea is that if telepathy does exist, it's possibly a very, very weak signal compared to all the background noise. So you try to dampen out all that background noise in the hope that the signal will come through. And yeah, there was a recent meta-analysis. I mean, as not surprisingly, written by people who were proponents of the paranormal, but they concluded that 40 years of research suggests that there really is an effect there. They were quite convinced that there was an effect there. I would have my reasons for not being convinced by that. I mean, for one thing, the history of parapsychology has been pretty much a history of false dawns. It's always, they're on the verge of establishing these things, and yet we never quite seem to get there. So I kind of withhold judgment on those things. But as I say, it's important to kind of acknowledge that there is some evidence there that's a bigger challenge to skeptics than others.
Let's try to distinguish the terms that we're using, tease them apart with precise definitions, or as good as we can. And I'd like to distinguish between paranormal, anomalous experiences, which is your core way of thinking, parapsychology, and psi. How would you distinguish those four elements?
I think psi would probably be the term that many parapsychologists would prefer when they're talking about the kind of thing that they are studying, and that probably would be limited to evidence relating to ESP, extrasensory perception, PK, psychokinesis, and evidence relating to life after death. They'd have quite a strict definition that they included those things. They wouldn't go kind of beyond that. When it comes to the term paranormal, then it really depends upon who you ask. For most parapsychologists, again, they would probably prefer that rather strict definition that I've just outlined. Anomalistic psychologists and the mass media would go for the kind of anything weird and wonderful type approach that I mentioned earlier. So parapsychology is the attempt to apply scientific method to testing whether any genuinely paranormal phenomena actually occur. And I mean, an anomalistic psychology takes a kind of more skeptical approach, whereas as a working hypothesis, and I can't emphasize this enough, as a working hypothesis only, we say, well, let's just assume that paranormal forces don't exist. Can we explain the weird experiences that people report in other ways? In other words, in psychological terms. So it's not in a sense that it's opposed to parapsychology, and it's quite possible we can certainly conceive of a situation where, I mean, I think a lot of the time when people believe they've had a paranormal experience, we can be pretty sure they haven't. It can be explained plausibly in terms of conventional scientific concepts, but that doesn't mean that it's always the case that we can explain those things in terms of conventional scientific concepts. So it's possible that both approaches would have something to offer. I've got to the point now where I'm not convinced that any genuine paranormal phenomena exist. And by that, I mean phenomena that cannot be explained in terms of conventional science. But as I keep on emphasizing, I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
Yeah, and give a brief history of your journey, because I really appreciated that, and had some similar experiences myself from your early history, where you were fascinated with the paranormal as a believer, or maybe not quite as a believer, as what I'd call a want-to-be believer. I think I was in the want-to-be believer category, to a dogmatic, dismissive skeptic, to now, as you've just described, your more nuanced approach, as expressed in your book.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, all the way through childhood, teenage years, early adulthood, all the way through doing a psychology degree, I would say I was a believer. I thought I took a lot of this stuff very seriously. I mean, just one illustration of that is that while I was doing my PhD to earn a bit of extra cash, I used to give talks at the local adult education college, and they asked for one on parapsychology. I gave them a lecture on parapsychology, which was totally uncritical, totally unskeptical. And they were probably all sitting there thinking, well, he's doing a PhD. He must know what he's talking about. Yeah, I cringe when I look back at that. But then I discovered the joys of skepticism because someone recommended a particular book, and it had a huge impact on my life. It was called Parapsychology, Science or Magic, by a Canadian social psychologist called James Alcock. And it was the first book I'd ever read that offered a skeptical perspective on all these topics. And I not only really enjoyed the book, but I found it very convincing. And then really what started off as a kind of side interest, a hobby. And in those initial years of skepticism, I think I kind of became a bit of what I would now see as being a bit of an extreme skeptic. I kind of had various beliefs and attitudes that anybody who claimed to have psychic ability, well, they were either crazy or they were charlatans. There was no possibility of any other explanation. That all paranormal beliefs were kind of dangerous and people shouldn't hold them, and a whole range of other views that I would reject. And I recognize that I may be wrong, but I think that most people who claim that they've got some kind of paranormal abilities, some psychic abilities, genuinely believe that they have. And that's really interesting. And a lot of paranormal beliefs can be psychologically beneficial in various ways. Just because it's not true doesn't mean it's not psychologically helpful. And so, I've kind of gone from being, as I say, a believer to being a fairly extreme skeptic back towards that middle ground. And I find I've got a lot more in common with the moderates on the other side of the debate than some of the extremists on my side.
Hmm. Well, we bond over skepticism for sure. Being skeptical is the DNA of Closer to Truth. I'm skeptical of everything. I'm skeptical of theism. I'm skeptical of atheism. I'm skeptical of agnosticism. And I'm even skeptical about skeptics.
I thought you might be.
We also bonded with respect to Sue Blackmore because, as you wrote much in your book, she influenced your career, and Sue has been a long-term friend. She was on the original pilot of Closer to Truth in 1996, and then several times she's been on 9 Closer to Truth TV stations, so TV episodes. So if you see Sue again, give her my warm regards.
I definitely will.
One question is, how much in rejecting I've seen people reject the evidence of psi because they say it's a priori impossible. And so therefore there must be a flaw in the data or methodological. And a lot of times there is, or maybe all the time. But the flow of the arrow of the argument goes from an a priori assumption that it's impossible to then seeing the data as flawed, as opposed to the other way around, which should be the traditional way of science.
I agree. I don't buy that argument at all that we know it's impossible. I mean, there have been too many examples in the past where the scientific consensus was wrong, and it's as simple as that. Once upon a time, we didn't believe that meteorites could be rocks flying from outer space because there are no rocks in space. Well, that's wrong. There are, and there's lots of other examples, continental drift, etc., etc. So again, a lot of the time, the parapsychologists will point to those kind of examples and say that science has been wrong, but mainstream science has been wrong before. It's wrong again. I think Carl Sagan was the one who kind of pointed out that, yes, okay, they laughed at Galileo, but they also laughed at Bonzo the clown, I think it was, or something like this. I mean, most of the time when people claim they've got some kind of idea that contradicts mainstream science, it turns out to be wrong.
Right.
But we must always bear in mind the possibility that sometimes it's right. Very occasionally it's right. And so you have to be open to that possibility.
Okay. On a scale from 1 to 100, what's the likelihood, in your opinion, that even one paranormal or psi occurrence out of the innumerable anecdotal accounts, discard, but one will permanently escape the explanatory power of science? On a scale of 1 to 10, what's the likelihood that even that one will be found?
On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd maybe say 2.
Okay. All right. I'll hold you to it, Chris. Many thanks, Chris. The Science of Weird Shit is an important contribution to our thinking about belief systems as well as the paranormal, and it's a great read. Viewers can watch over 1,500 Closer to Truth videos and over 100 Closer to Truth TV episodes on mind and consciousness on the Closer to Truth website and YouTube channel, brain mechanisms, free will, personal identity, panpsychism, dualism, idealism, yes, souls and spirits, life after death, cosmic consciousness, and even ESP and parapsychology, but all infused with critical thinking. We appreciate your support of Closer to Truth. Tell your friends, like our videos, donate as you can. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing. Closer to Truth is now accepting your tax-exempt donations. Please come to closertotruth.com/donate. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks for watching.